Munira Mirza is the head of the former Number 10 Downing Street Policy Unit and the director of Civic Future, a charity which tries to attract talented people to stand for public office. Munira, you've worked at the very highest levels of British government, in the Mayor of London's office and then as head of the Prime Minister's Policy Unit at Number 10 Downing Street. And it was a particularly tumultuous time when you were there with Brexit and COVID and Ukraine and so on. And since leaving, you've written an awful lot about the poverty of political leadership in Britain. So can you tell me, what did you learn from your time in government and why do you think our political leaders are worse today than in the past?
So I should caveat what I say about what's wrong with political leadership by just saying I also worked with some very brilliant people, very brilliant civil servants, some very, very good ministers who I think in the face of a lot of pressure and adversity made good decisions and tried very hard. But overall, my impression was that the people who are running the country and the quality of decision-making at the top is not as good as it should be. Considering how world-leading Britain is in so many areas, in business and finance and science, tech, it's just extraordinary to me that more of our very smart, capable people don't go into public life. And when I was in Number 10, I thought that the kinds of people who do very well in our political system are often the pushiest and the most ambitious. Our system sort of rewards people who are good on TV, who can speak in sound bites. It rewards a sort of short-termism in thinking. So how can we get out of this very bad news headline today, rather than thinking more long-term? And what would the consequences be for the country over a course of years, rather than just over the next week? So I think some of that is just to do with politics generally. It was ever thus, but some of it is about the caliber and the quality of people and the seriousness of people. And I felt when I left government that the one thing that we could do to try and improve things, there are many things we need to do, but the one thing we could do, which would be very, very high impact, would be to try and get more very talented people inside politics.
Is that because politics is less of a sort of high status place than it was a few years ago? I remember, 40 years ago, people very much looked up to MPs. They wanted to be MPs. Whereas today, with the various aspects of the job, which I think have changed in the last 40 years, don't you agree? Not enough talented people are even considering going into public life in the first place.
Yeah, and I don't think this is completely unique to the UK. I remember I think a year or two before he passed away, Henry Kissinger wrote a really beautiful chapter at the end of his book on leadership, where he talks about a general decline in political leadership across the US and Europe, across basically Western liberal democracies. And he points out that there's a kind of mediocrity in politics, and that tends to mean that very good people are sort of turned off by it. He makes the point that the decline of deep thinking, of intellectual life, the loss of a sense of national duty and service, this sort of noblesse oblige idea that the wealthy elite would, at least some of them, would go on into public life. And he makes the point, I think, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he talked about people are more likely to be globe-trotting, making money in the financial services or working for an NGO rather than doing something as old-fashioned as working for their country. So I think it is a general problem in liberal democracies, but it's also we have a particular problem in the UK, I think, which is that if you look at the kinds of people who become ministers in the cabinet today, and this is not unique to a particular political party, I'm making a general point across the spectrum. We get very few people who have led large businesses or who have been entrepreneurs, or who have served in the army. I mean, if you compare it to cabinets of the past under Baldwin or Leland or even Thatcher, there were still heavyweight individuals who were going into public life, and they were bringing quite considerable experience. They'd had experience of making decisions under pressure. I think the kinds of people who are left in the pool of MPs because of course our system selects ministers from the pool of backbench MPs. The kinds of people who are left are the sort of the ambitious and the, sometimes not, people, dubious moral quality, let's say. You just look at the rates of, allegations of sexual harassment in Parliament. This, it's pretty high for any workplace. So I think that's a real issue, that, the kinds of people who are now going into the system are probably on balance worse. It's very hard to point to evidence for it, but nobody says that it's getting better. And I think that's quite telling. Nobody says, the cabinet today is, 100 times better than it was in the past. It's never said.
Well, the cabinet today, I don't think there's a single person who ever made any money at all out of entrepreneurship or running a business themselves. Not one. I mean, it is extraordinary to think you've got an entire political class that, especially one that is telling business what to do, and they've never made a penny from that themselves. What about the other thing I seem to remember Henry Kissinger talking about was the effect of social media and the way in which social media has altered. I think you've written about this in one of your articles for Engelsberg, about how social media has changed the political world in such a way that ordinary, normal and talented people don't go to it. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think, so he makes the point that people don't read anymore. They don't read history, they don't read biography. It's very unusual in politics. It's partly because time is always a constraint. It's very unusual to meet people in politics who are reading whole books as opposed to reading Twitter. And I think that means that the quality of understanding of what's going on in society, how it compares to the past, just has been diminished. So that's one factor. It's also just the general 24-hour news cycle that you're always thinking the short term. History is a very good reminder of the deep structural trends that you have to be aware of. And it's also quite a good way of, I think, of finding perspective. So the thing that you are getting hysterical about inside government and that on a particular day, it's worth having a sense of perspective. Is this truly a great crisis? There'll be some news story about a particular local situation. I remember, I have to say, one of my worst moments was you might not remember this, Andrew, but Geronimo the alpaca, which was a
no, I'm afraid I have somehow forgotten Geronimo the alpaca issue. Tell me about the scandal regarding Geronimo? No, start from the beginning. No, my listeners are going to want to know all about Geronimo the alpaca, I can assure you.
This was it was in summer of, I think, 2021. It was a very cute alpaca who had been tested for bovine tuberculosis, which is quite a serious disease if you live in the countryside. And it can really affect cattle, and farmers are, if they find any of their herd are affected by this disease, they have to terminate. I think it's the right technical word.
I remember. I've forgotten he was called Geronimo, but now I remember the story.
It was a very particularly cute animal, and obviously because it was in the middle of recess in Parliament, nothing else was going on in the news, and the tabloids decided to make a big campaign. The family were very, very. We probably shouldn't joke about it. I'll probably get lots of hate mail talking about
save Geronimo. Was it? Was that what the papers were trying to say?
And sadly, I think Geronimo in the end did have to be terminated. But for several hours in government, this was something that do we have to proceed with this? Should we change the rules around what happens to animals if they're tested positive? And anyway, this is all just to say that it was.
How did history help you in this area, Munira?
Well, I think history, but also contemporary events. You have to look at the state of the country and remind yourself that these sort of media storms that exist. I mean, even I would say to some extent, things like the 2020 was a year of lots of mini crises or large crises to do with COVID and to do with lockdown, but also the Black Lives Matter marches that were going on through London and also the US and other parts of the world at this time, you have to look at, how big public protests like that and the kinds of things that people are very exercised about, looking back in time, is Black Lives Matter and the kinds of things that they're complaining about. The same as the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s. I thought at the time that it wasn't. I thought that there were very, very different circumstances, but lots of people were trying to act like they were the same thing. And I think
It was
an
cosplaying it,
understanding
basically, wasn't it? That's
exactly,
what was happening, yeah.
And people trying to aggrandize for their campaign and their cause. And it's useful to be able to take a step back and say, have the right perspective.
There are two other areas for at least that I think of when I think about why talented people aren't going into public life. One of them, obviously, is the financial one. If you go off and get a job in the city instead, you'll be paid many multiple times more. And the second one is the effect on family life as well, and your wife and children if you're a man going into politics. What about those? Is there anything that can be done apart from obviously paying politicians more? We do underpay them terribly, in my view. But is there anything sort of structural in that way that we can do to protect the families and to show that it's a high status job rather than presently where we see MPs as rather low status?
Mm. So I think pay is important, but it's not as important as, or it's not, I think, the only decisive factor. And in fact, in the past, many MPs who had been very successful in business have made enough money and could afford the pay cuts. And that's also the case today. There are many people who've been successful who could afford to.
But they're not going to go in
not for the rest
when they're young, are they? They're not going to do it in their 20s.
No.
It's a big difference between making your money and coming in your 50s than actually having the young, talented person who could have made money if they wanted to, but instead dedicate themselves to public life from their 20s onwards.
Yeah. Lots of people will still continue, for example, to go into journalism. We have very talented journalists, or we're working in charity sectors. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I think it's something that a lot of people will overcome if they feel motivated to. And to some extent, it's the same with media intrusion and personal scrutiny. I think the thing that's really lacking, you've hit the nail on the head when you talked about low status, that the more mediocre and low quality your political class looks, the less good people want to be associated with it. It's like Gresham's law, the bad money drives out the good. Well, the bad personalities drive out the good ones. And part of what I've been trying to do is to think, how do we both increase the status of political life, public life, by proactively going out and finding intelligent people and saying this should be a high status thing, that we want people who are serious, who read, who think, and want to bring them together. I don't think political parties have been very good at that.
No, but you've set up an organisation that does do that. Civic Future. It tries to tackle this very problem. We can see what inspired you to start it. It's your own time in government, seeing quite how inadequate and ineffective so many politicians are. But what does Civic Future do to try to tackle this problem?
So I set up Civic Future as a charity in 2022. And we're effectively creating a talent pipeline that people who want to go into public life, but who are currently put off going through the party political system. So we run elite fellowship programs to people who are serious about getting involved in politics and who are very up for reading and debating and meeting people who've worked in public life, meeting politicians, diplomats, business people, and so on. And those programs are free because we want it to be trackable, but they're highly competitive. So we're not embarrassed at all to say that this is about the elite. This is about people who are successful or could be successful in their lives. And the fellowship program that we began with, which we launched at the beginning, is for people in their 20s. So it's sort of early investment in talent. We don't expect those people to become politicians overnight or to become senior civil servants, but we want to build the foundations with them for understanding how the world works, and to get them into the good habits of reading, of thinking, of building their network, so that at the point when they do want to progress, or they do want to get to those high positions where they're making decisions, they've already done quite a lot of preparation, and they're in a position where they can do it. I think this idea that a minister can just, through a reshuffle, on one day, wake up the next morning, become the Secretary of State for a subject, having never given it a moment's thought before, and suddenly become expert in it, is crazy. And we do that all the time. We sort of expect talent to rise naturally, and don't think, how do you actually cultivate the next elite? I mean, really successful societies don't just leave it to chance. They think quite carefully, what kinds of schools, what kinds of universities, what kind of institutions do we need to identify and select people? People are often surprised when I tell them that the Conservative Party used to have its own college. Up until the 1980s, it had a college in West Yorkshire called Swinton, and it would train activists and members, and various ministers would speak there and give lectures. And the Labour Party also had a college in Oxford, it had Ruskin, it had national educational schemes. And a lot of that has withered away. And I think with it, the ways in which people in the past would have come into contact with politicians, would have had the chance to read and learn and think and understand the country that they're living in. And so what we've tried to do is recreate some of that kind of institution. I think, how do we bring people together? It's fun. We have nice dinners, and we take people to Singapore for a week, and we give them a chance to get to know each other. But really, it's about trying to build a sense of camaraderie and purpose.
It's a fantastic organisation. It really is. It's one of the few things that really makes me feel optimistic about Britain today. In the old days, it would have been Oxford and Cambridge and other universities that did exactly that. That everything that you've just been mentioning, really. Why aren't our universities doing essentially what Civic Future is trying to do already?
Well, we still have the Oxford PGE course, which is sort of famous in Britain for being a kind of proving ground for young politicians. And we have the Oxford Union.
Good thing or a bad thing in your view, Munira? Because it's very controversial, isn't it, considering some of the people who've come out of it?
Yeah, and interestingly, most of the graduates today don't go into public life. Actually, they'll go into the private sector, and for the reasons that we've talked about. I think it's a very narrow route for a lot of people. So that's it's a particular way of thinking about the world of learning. But what about the scientists? What about the people who come through other routes, who have different ways of thinking? I think that the PhD route is too narrow a pool to draw from. More generally, universities have, because of their funding model, they are much more international. So there are courses in government, there are postgraduate courses. But actually, most of the people who do those courses in Britain tend to be from abroad. I mean, if you look at some of the most prestigious schools of government in the UK, like the Blavatnik School in Oxford, it's an excellent school, but 90% of its cohort is international. So I think we're very good at educating the world's elites. We're just not very good at educating our own elites, Britain's elites. And, going through that kind of university education, I think, is expensive and not accessible to a lot of people. And when I set up Civic Future, I spent quite a lot of time looking at other countries, and I think other countries just have more independent pipelines for talent. They're just various organisations, non-profit organisations that exist. But in Britain, I think our universities don't really do it. The other thing I would say about universities is that they perhaps they don't have that sense that we talked about with Henry Kissinger's point about noblesse oblige. I don't think universities in this country really have a sense that they are responsible for cultivating the future elite in that way. I think university education is often presented now as fulfilling your individual dreams, your individual career. The idea that you should be interested in the future of your country has not really been uppermost in the way in which universities talk about what they offer. And I think that is partly maybe a sense of national embarrassment about service to the nation, and the idea that you might make a sacrifice in some way for your country. It's
And
not
the
really the
general.
language in which universities speak today. So I don't think the signalling from university is encouraging people to go into public life.
You mentioned that I completely agree. I think that there's a sort of irresponsibility that have
Mm.
overtaken dons in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, tragically. You mentioned Singapore as one of the places that you take your Civic Future fellows, and you're an
Mm.
admirer of Lee Kuan Yew and the extraordinary achievements that he wrought in Singapore. Tell us more about that. Tell us more about why he's your hero.
So you could make a case that he is possibly the most effective political leader of the 20th century if you judge success by the journey that a leader's country has made in their lifetime, under their governance. This title of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs is From Third World to First, and it is really extraordinary story of how this tiny country, which on the day of independence in 1965, had no natural resources, no army, didn't even have an independent water supply. It had been kicked out of the Malay Federation, so it wasn't a choice to become independent at that point. It really was on its own. The fact that it survived, not only survived, but actually thrived is, I think, partly a legacy of British colonial rule, if I'm honest. The fact that we left certain institutions, it had a legal framework, but really largely down to him as a leader. He is regarded in Singapore as the heroic founder, the heroic figure. And in many ways, he had a realistic understanding of the dangers that Singapore faced, and had an intuition that the way to save the country and to develop it was to invest in the talent of his people. He was completely hard-headed, I think partly formed by his experience of living under Japanese occupation during the war. So he had no kind of idealist naivety about, human beings. He completely understood man's capacity for inhumanity, and therefore he was quite ruthless and pragmatic. Singapore at that time was, actually quite serious risk of communist takeover, and didn't have, as I said, many natural resources or any kind of really economic strength. And I think what he did is he realised that Singapore would have to pivot towards attracting international investment. He would have to root out corruption. It's today it's the least corrupt country in the world, at least according to certain metrics. And I think what singles him out, though, more than anything else, is that his ability to communicate. I mean, we get our fellows to watch clips of him on YouTube, and even though he didn't in the end create a liberal democracy in the sense that we understand it, he was very, very keen to persuade people to agree with him. He wasn't actually he didn't have the sense that many caters to that you should impose your view on people. He actually wanted to make an argument, and I think that's he speaks in just a very kind of straightforward way. His sentences are to the point. He's not afraid of people disagreeing with him. He will argue back. He's a very passionate speaker, and I think that sense of clarity and hard-headed realism for Singapore is something that other world leaders recognise. I mean, Kissinger writes about him in the book that we talked about earlier, and became a great friend of his, and would often consult him about what needed to be US foreign policy in that region, particularly around China. And Lee Kuan Yew became a sort of figure to lots of world leaders and would speak to them about his view. He'd just been around for a long time. That's the other thing, I suppose, about being a great leader. If you're around for a long time, you just learn and become wiser.
What other political leaders do you teach your fellows about? Who are the other ones that your fellows wind up admiring, along with Lee Kuan Yew? Anyone else in particular?
Well, many of the people that you have written about, of course, Panda. So, we set different readings and biographies, but there's So there's a real interest actually at the moment in those leaders who have a strong sense of the national interest. So de Gaulle is, I think, becoming more and more popular as a figure, not because he was necessarily the easiest person to get on with, or the nicest.
It certainly wasn't that.
It's maybe an understatement. But kind of chutzpah and belief, both self-belief, but belief in France as an idea. So that's something that we've started reading on some of our courses. There from the biographies of him. Churchill, of course, is just a fascinating figure. But we think actually the what's interesting about Churchill is that he's a good example of someone who history had been different and he had not become prime minister during the war. Would he have been regarded as a great historical figure? I mean, the chances are not.
No.
Some people just rise to the occasion because the situation demands it. But his career up until that point was not necessarily going to go down in the history books in the way that it did. And so maybe
he was always going to be more than a footnote. I mean, he was at the founding of the welfare state, and he got the First World War Navy, ready for the First World War and so on. But you're right, quite right. He's not somebody that would be, taught at Civic Future, for example. I don't think you're right. Yes, absolutely right.
I feel bad for saying anything that possibly negative about him. I know he's your
Quite right.
Great hero as well.
One of our shared heroes is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's written about the threat of Islamism to the West, which I know concerns you as well. Do you think our politicians are doing enough to counter this threat, this danger today?
I think there is a general ambivalence around this as an issue. I think some politicians, in fairness, I think David Cameron, when he gave his speech to the Munich Security Conference, I think way back in the early 2010s, did recognise that this was a problem. But on balance, what keeps happening is our political leaders fear that they need to appeal to or engage with more extreme views, extreme Muslim opinion, in order to try and bind them in. And I think that is a mistake. And you see this particularly at the local political level, where local authorities often invite unelected community leaders with quite dodgy opinions to come in and build political relationships with them to try and get out the votes. And they always see this in a very, as I said before, in a short-term way. They think that that's going to be a way of shoring up their vote and their support. And what always happens is you end up supporting the more extreme elements and giving them more currency. So I think that there is a kind of lack of understanding about the level of threat that Islamism poses. Britain is becoming a more diverse society. The Muslim population is growing. There is a moderate Muslim population, but it's always there's a competition between the moderate and the more extreme form. And I think Islamism is a poison. I think we have to try and be quite clear about the threat that it poses. And it's not in favor of liberal democracies. We've seen in many other countries around the world that is often very hostile to genuine democracy.
Are you worried about the Green Party being taken over by Islamists?
Well, I run a charity, so I have to be careful not to wade too much into contemporary politics. But I think that on the left, there's certainly a naivety or possibly a sympathy with a lot of the anti-Western views that Islamists have. Obviously, a lot of this has been triggered by October the 7th and around the conflicts in Gaza. But really, that's just one event in a very long history of the flirtation between parts of the left and Islamist kind of extreme feeling. I think there's a line in one of your books, I think it's Read It and War, where you talk about Churchill's experience of fighting or being on the border, the Afghan-Pakistan border, and seeing Islamist fundamentalism in its extreme form, and that was what alerted him to the dangers of Nazism. I think that's fascinating that we're now we're now seeing Islamism, and it should be the memory of Nazism that alerts us to the dangers of extremist views. That these tendencies repeat in history, that we should see them for what they are, but too often people come to it quite late, and they think that what they're seeing is just the expression of a kind of normal religious identity or a normal feeling. But actually, the politicization of religion in that way is something that we should be quite wary of.
And we're seeing that also, of course, aren't we, in this horrific rise in anti-Semitism in this country?
Yeah, which is, it's been unfortunately part of the Islamic world for a very long time, but has now mingled in with other, political tendencies on the left as well, and it's become really a form of anti-imperialism, just with a different guise, as well as the old tropes of anti-Semitism, which are very explicitly about Jews as a religious group. It's also about Jews and association with America and capitalism and so on. And so I think we're in a very sad place that kind of way of thinking and identifying an enemy has become a mainstream, sadly very mainstream, I think, in the Muslim world and in the Muslim population.
Now, you mentioned earlier in this conversation about how talented people tended to naturally get to the top in society, which obviously requires a meritocracy, the kind of meritocracy that Lee Kuan Yew and Margaret Thatcher and others believed in. But have we still got one in this country? We see some statistics coming out of the ONS and so on about social mobility actually slowing down. Rather dangerous and worrying thing if a meritocracy is not, the thing that we should all be working for. And there are various forces in society that seem to be opposed to meritocracy. What's your feeling about this? Because if that is the case, then that's going to be bad news for Civic Future and its fellows in the future.
Well, I mean, certainly, as you say, Lee Kuan Yew was absolutely committed to meritocracy and resisted actually quite hard at the beginning, just after independence. He resisted the idea of quotas for the Malay population to go into the civil service and other high-level positions, because he said that everyone should be treated the same. There should be no favors, and there should be no kind of social engineering. That view, sadly, is not always the case in the UK and I guess in the US up until very recently. I think there are lots of institutions that maybe not explicitly but implicitly are trying to, in the name of inclusion, to try and widen or diversify their workforce or the people they reach to ethnicity or gender, whatever it is, rather than on the kind of talent that people have. You see this in universities as well. There's clearly, I would say, in the elite universities, a kind of desire now to take into account things like ethnicity and gender in a way that I think might harm the merit principle. We don't do that. So at Future, we're very clear. We select people. We don't have targets or quotas. There is a separate thing, which is, do we have enough social mobility in this country? Are people actually coming through? I think there is a challenge there. But it's not, you don't fix it by having targets, but you do have to fix it by having a dynamic economy and having really good jobs and having a reason for people to aspire to be educated and to do well. And that could be through university, but it's also through things like vocational training, through apprenticeships. I mean, a lot of the old industries that could be, great engines for social mobility haven't been expanding at the rate that they should be, even in the last 20 years. I mean, we've done lots of things to harm the country's economy and to make it harder for really great businesses to employ people. We've increased regulation, we've increased taxes. Industries like the defense industry, which should really be a strength for Britain, should be recruiting thousands of people, just haven't been growing at the rate they should. So I think that's a different question. And often what happens around the arguments around meritocracy is that they end up being about how can we get this very quick fix, increasing the number of people who get into a university from a particular background. But really a broader analysis would be, let's say, how do we get more people to increase the possibilities that people have, the choices they can make, and make it easier for them to get the training and the education they need, regardless of what their background is.
And uh, part of the problem has been seen with the Office of National Statistics, which said that public trust in government has now dropped below 40%. Are you worried that the whole of the values of liberal democracy are up for grabs? You know, Civic Future is obviously grounded in that, but don't you worry that liberal democracy is falling out of favour with people? We've had 7 prime ministers in a decade, might have another one before too long. China's building its huge infrastructure. It's now competing in technology like AI and robotics and batteries and so on. A worrying number of people online are expressing their admiration for Putin and Xi. I mean, how do we revive faith in our own system? How do we point out that liberal democracy is a better system, considering we seem to be losing out?
Remind people that China has indeed lifted many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but they also would have probably lifted more people out of poverty and been able to award greater freedoms to people had they not been a communist state. And I think there is sometimes a kind of sort of implicit envy from some people, some commentators in Western countries, that countries like China can just cut through democratic consent and get things done. There's this idea that the Chinese state is just more effective than a liberal democracy would be, which has to think about democratic consent, it has to bring people on board, it has to manage elections and so on, and the turbulence that comes with that. But I think we have to remind people that the great episodes of innovation that have happened in the world have largely come out of up to now countries which have been more democratic, which have been more innovative because they've allowed the circulation of ideas, and therefore our science and technology base is still far in advance of the other countries. So even though we're going through quite a difficult period at the moment, our societies tend to have a much better error correction mechanism, and we do have the capacity to improve. So, history is a good way of reminding people that in Britain, in particular, we've gone through decades in the past where we've had, old systems have been dying and new systems have emerged. And you look at the 1940s or the 1970s, those are periods of stagnation or people feeling exhausted and feeling detached or disaffected, and yet the political class somehow or other. The elites have managed to renew and come up with a new system. That's not possible in a country like China in the same way. And actually, I think that they are heading towards quite significant demographic decline. I mean, the population will probably halve by the end of the century or get close to that. There's some major challenges there, and our system can adjust. So I think reminding people of the great achievements that we've had and what we have to preserve is part of it, and giving a sense of why is Western civilization, if that's not too grand a phrase, why has it been so uniquely successful in history? What has it? Why has it created this incredible economic, social progress? Precisely because of this emphasis on freedom, these core liberal values. Which have been really powerful.
What book are you reading? What history book or biography are you reading at the moment, Munira?
So I just finished Howell Williams's biography of Charlemagne, which I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed it partly because it's not a period of history that I know very well, and Charlemagne has fascinated me because I watched years ago Kenneth Clark's Civilization, and I don't know if you.
Oh, I remember Kenneth Clark's Civilization, but I can't remember what he said about Charlemagne. What was the what was the story?
The first episode is called "The Skin of Our Teeth," and it's effectively he tells the story of how Western civilization was on the verge of complete obliteration in the Dark Ages, and then Charlemagne effectively comes along and renews Christian Western civilization. He was he's a paradox in some ways because he was a barbarian. He was king of the Franks and was a warrior, so he certainly wasn't averse to massacring lots of people, massacring Saxons. He took over a lot of territory, but he was also literate. He could read. He could write. He never got the hang of it, but he could read, and he was very preoccupied with how do you hold together Europe? How do you keep all these different peoples in one kind of entity? And he created these libraries and employed copyists to reproduce Latin books and to reconnect back to ancient civilizations by Byzantium. And I think he's a fascinating figure because he actually cared about culture. He took seriously the idea that the territory that he looked after, it couldn't just be held together by war, by violence. It had to be, he had to use language and culture and art forms to try and bring people together in some way. And I think that's, it's a fascinating period. And I think he's underrated. I don't know why there hasn't been a major biopic film about him. Maybe there should be one, because he was a really fascinating character.
The key thing is we shouldn't allow Ridley Scott to make it. Otherwise, he completely wreck it. You come away thinking Charlemagne was a pathetic little weed who nobody would ever want to follow. What about
He did love his children. He was very devoted to all his children.
Did he really? Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, that's
he had many concubines.
Unusual for those days. Well, you can love your children and have many concubines, I suppose. What's your chosen counterfactual, your what if of history?
If the Ottomans hadn't restricted the use of the printing press, would we have seen a greater kind of flourishing of ideas and public intellectual life in the Ottoman Empire earlier? So they didn't ban the printing press in the 15th century, but they did restrict its use. That you couldn't print Arabic scripts. And there's an argument, I guess, that was one of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire fell behind in terms of technology and fell behind the Western nations in terms of its economy.
Yeah,
and it's clearly that the kind of the culture of Islam didn't go through the same sort of reformation that Christianity did, but it can work both ways. You could also see more fundamentalism and more kind of adherence to scripts and the circulation of more extreme ideas. It's not guaranteed, but
no, I doubt it. I think what happened to the Jewish and Christian faiths were driven very much by the extension of knowledge. And if you had that in the Islamic world, we know that one of the driving forces behind fanatical Islamism, not least because of what Osama bin Laden actually said about the caliphate and the fall of the caliphate, of the Ottoman caliphate, is driven by this fury and hatred and resentment of the West for having had all these advantages, which would have flown, I think, from Islamic printing presses spreading all the extraordinary achievements that they had up until that point. Yeah, I think that's I think that's probably the best what if of all of the ones that I've been asking for the last however many years I've been doing this podcast. It's absolutely brilliant one. That's a great
my goodness,
what if.
That's a great honour.
It's a wonderful counterfactual, not least because it obviously has this sort of optimistic drive. And that's very much part of what you're all about and what Civic Future's about. And so, Munira Mirza, thank you very much indeed for giving us some reasons for optimism. And anybody who, like me, admires what you do should go to www.civicfuture.org and learn more about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Munira. My next guest on Secrets of Statecraft is Dan Wong, author of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And a fellow of the Hoover Institution, he's one of the most cited experts on China's technological capabilities.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.